Welcome to PAR Podcast, episode 76.34. PAR Podcast is an audio supplement for Public Administration Review, the premier professional journal in the field of public administration. This year, 2016, inaugurates PAR's 76th year of furthering public administration research, theory, and practice. This episode features comments by Daniel Esty, who is the Hillhouse Professor at Yale University, with primary appointments in Yale's Law and Environment schools and a secondary appointment at the Yale School of Management. Professor Esty discusses his article titled Regulatory Transformation: Lessons from Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. This article is currently available on Early View and will be published in Public Administration Review, Issue 76, Volume 3.
So regulatory agencies across the federal government and state governments and even at the local level are facing today enormous pressures and challenges, pressures to become more modern, more effective, more efficient, and to deliver their mission at ever lower cost. A good number of these agencies face significant budget crunches, are facing the prospect of having to do their work with fewer people. And beyond all that, they're being criticized for the red tape that they impose, particularly on the business community. Some are even calling for wholesale trimming of regulatory agencies at various scales. The EPA has been pushed by a number of Republicans, particularly in the Congress, and some beyond that, as a burden, as a drag on the economy. And so there really is a need in regulatory agencies across the board to think about transformation. And in this podcast, I want to share some thoughts on both what the literature tells us is the right way forward and how to create a 21st century model regulatory agency and what the process of that transformation might look like. And also, having recently been the commissioner of Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, I want to share some perspectives from the practice that I was able to engage in over 3 years on leave from my position as a professor at Yale. So let me start by saying that I think there is an emerging set of best practices that are part of what regulatory agency managers have come to understand as a package that can be brought to bear as they push forward new ways of doing business and, frankly, new processes for getting to those new ways of doing business. And I think one of the core starting points, and it's really a lesson drawn from the business world, is that every agency needs to be very clear on its mission. Having a clear vision and laying that out for all to see, particularly those within the agency who are being asked to carry out this mission, is really quite critical. And the process of developing that mission is also important. One needs to have a broad conversation with the regulated community, with the public and representatives of the public interest, and then, of course, with those within the agency who are going to be asked to deliver on whatever mission is developed. It's especially critical that the managers within the agency have buy-in, have ownership of that mission, and are really committed to carrying it forward once it's clarified. And then, like in the business world, it's not enough to have a vision or a mission. You really need to have an implementation strategy. Execution is what is really key. And I think that's been misunderstood or underappreciated in the public sector over a good bit of recent years. So I think a focus on implementation becomes a central element of regulatory success and a critical part of the regulatory transformation that so many agencies are being asked to undergo. And I do think in that regard, one has to pay special attention to the capacity of agencies to continue to do the work they've been asked to do, to deliver on the public regulatory requirements that most everyone does want to have. We want to have environmental protection, banking regulation, insurance standards, but we also want to have that done at lower cost and with lower regulatory burdens. I think the real goal in this regard is to create a lighter regulatory framework without lowering standards. So again, lighter framework, but not lower standards. The public does want robust regulation in many circumstances. And I think in terms of the other element that's critical here is an investment in people. That's true in business. The best businesses understand that their most critical resource, their most critical asset is their people, and they spend a lot of time with investments in human resources. I think government entities need to do the same. It is absolutely essential that the people that are what an agency is made up of are invested in its future and understand what they're being asked to do and how to carry this forward. And I think in that regard, having good communications, having training programs, having investments in what those people need to do their job well, whether that's software or hardware, is absolutely essential. Beyond that, I think there's 5 core elements of what a 21st century regulatory agency needs to focus on as it makes itself into that cutting edge agency that it needs to be going forward. Number 1 is a focus on integration. Agencies need to focus on the multiple goals that every one of us has. If you're an environment agency, optimizing the environment is not good enough. You need to be thinking about energy and the environment as an integrated package, and beyond that on the economic impacts of the regulatory program you put forward. So at the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, the acronym being DEEP, I used to like to joke that we would spell that DEEP acronym with 3 E's: energy, the environment, and the economy, because all 3 were required for success. I think it's also important for regulatory agencies to understand that they have to pay attention to the costs of regulation. There's an implicit calculation going on in the political arena every day about whether the benefits of regulatory activity are sufficient to justify the costs, and agencies need to be attentive to that. A second critical element for the 21st century regulatory agency is innovation. It needs to be at the heart of everything that regulatory agencies do. Agencies need to figure out how to remake the flow of their regulatory processes. In Connecticut, we brought in a lean consultant, borrowing this lean concept from manufacturing, and used that to re-engineer all 29 of our permitting programs and dozens of other agencies' activities as well. And what that allowed us to do was to take out inefficient steps in the process and to streamline everything we were doing to try to produce faster, more effective results, ones that were more public-facing, better positioned in terms of meeting the needs of the regulated community, but also delivering on the public expectations as well. In addition to that, we spent a good bit of time eliminating outdated, outmoded, or duplicative statutes and regulations. And taking out that outdated activity left resources freed up to take on the now increasing focus on the critical missions that the agency had identified. I think there's also a set of tools that a 21st century agency can bring to bear, including electronic files so that you're getting parallel processing and review by all the people that need to be involved in a decision, cutting-edge information technologies, smart forms, and other ways of ensuring that the technology advances of recent years are brought to bear in the regulatory realm. And I also think a third element of critical focus for a regulatory transformation needs to be incentives. We need to understand what does the framework of the regulatory process induce people to do, both in terms of the outside regulated community, the companies that are being regulated, but also within the agency. What are the incentives that are present? And increasingly, particularly in the environmental domain, it's important to think about how we might move from a strategy of command and control government mandates to a more economic, incentive-minded approach, a more market mechanisms as a way to guide behavior. Again, in the environmental arena, thinking about the polluter pays principle, making people pay for the harm they cause as the centerpiece of their activity. The fourth critical element for 21st century regulatory success is investment. Understanding where the money is going to come from for the kinds of things that have to be paid for. Who's going to provide the resources to get those big investments in pollution control done? This is not a topic that was of much focus in the 20th century. People assumed that if government passed laws and regulations were written, that the incentives would follow and the investment would follow, but that has proven not to be the case. So I think in the 21st century, we need to pay attention to a regulatory framework that is not just about red lights telling people to stop what they can't do, but also about green lights, trying to signal the business community to go forward and to make investments in particular categories of activity that have public benefits. For example, clean energy. We're not going to get where we need to go in terms of energy efficiency and renewable power simply by telling people what they cannot do. We need a green light strategy that encourages investment in new technologies, and beyond that really provides incentives for innovation across the board in terms of how we engage the public on clean energy, how we finance clean energy, and beyond that, how we deliver and deploy renewable energy projects. So I think thinking about the incentives for action is quite critical. Finally, implementation. In the 20th century, we paid too little attention to on-the-ground results. We thought success was achieved once a law was passed or a regulation put forward. We now know that actual on-the-ground behavioral change is what's critical. We need to have more efficiency and effectiveness in our regulatory programs. We need data and metrics to track performance. And frankly, we need scorecards that allow us to compare those who are doing similar kinds of activities to figure out what's working and what's not. And we need a real commitment to continuous improvement, to thinking about which programs are delivering results and do more of them, and frankly, where we have programs that are not working, to be ready to declare failure, something governments have been very hesitant to do, and in declaring failure, pull back those resources and redeploy them. So in conclusion, there are regulatory agencies across the country, really across the globe, that are facing a transformation imperative. And that can be very challenging, but there are now a set of best practices to follow, beginning with clarity of vision and then focusing on execution, including a commitment to an integrated perspective on the challenges that the agency faces, the regulatory requirements it's meant to carry forward. Second, a real commitment to innovation at the heart of everything the agency does. Third, a recognition that incentives matter and a lot of attention needs to be paid to what those incentives are that are being put forward. Fourth, a focus on investment and where resources are going to come from to get done the work that needs to be done. And finally, an unrelenting focus on implementation, on execution, on making sure that the work is being done and done in a way that's both effective and efficient, so that we can ensure the public that they're getting a good deal for the money that's invested in regulatory programs, and that we're delivering over time lighter regulatory requirements, but not lower regulatory standards, delivering high results, high standards at the lowest possible cost. Thank you.
This concludes PAR Podcast, episode 76.34. To listen to additional episodes and learn more about Public Administration Review, please visit us online at publicadministrationreview.org. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at PA Review. Thanks for listening.